When spring had come, I had my fill. When that spring had come, I had my fill. Slash and burn at harvest time. Plant the pine and spruce and limes. For this ain't no work of man, with just another grain of sand. Yeah, with just another grain of sand. Oh, 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 slow cold burner rotting leaves feeds the hunger of the seed, where deep inside a memory waits for the day to cast its shade. A whistle blows right through my mind, standing in the hiring line. I pay my taxes when I can. I won't let them take my land. I was born on the Tejon Road, in a stand of trees where the willow grows.
Well, good day, everybody. Here we are at the Duncan Just a minute. Here we are at the Duncan Showroom tonight. My name's Longevity John. I'm your host. I know there's a bunch of people watching from across the country. Some people in Ottawa. Hi, Dean. How you doing? Old friend of mine. And Montreal and places like that. And it's storytelling night, which is a whole new concept for the Duncan Showroom. We have this thing called open mic, or we call it dress rehearsal Tuesday. And it's another form for open mic. And at one of those times, Michelle came along and from Thetis Island and did a song. Did about a 42-minute, wasn't it, Ted? Total time? 42 minutes nonstop, all rhyming, nothing in front of her, just went on, boom, and away it went. I was so astonished. I said, are there more of you? And she said, yes, there's storytelling guilds and groups all up and down the island and all over North America. And it's gaining fast recognition again. And there's actual festivals that go on. And the thing was that she couldn't get to the festival this year, even though she was looking forward to it. So she was able to film hers and send it to the virtual festival, which is what we're doing tonight, being able to let storytellers on the island actually have the opportunity to come up and get to an audience which they wouldn't normally get to, because they wouldn't all come to Victoria or Parksville or Nanaimo or anything like that. And tonight, by the way, we do have, as I understand it, there's three major groups right now that are working the South Island. There's the Victoria Storytellers Guild that's been together for 31 years. Yeah, that's pretty good. Then there's the let me get this right. There's the around town tellers from Nanaimo, and they've been together for 13 years, right? That's that's pretty phenomenal when you get people hanging out. Like when we have our open tomorrow night's flow for us, right, which is for the love of words, which is a poetry night, and we're in our 12th year, and we thought that was pretty good. But to be 13 years and 31 years, well, and then of course there's that fledgling little group, the Mid Island, which is just starting up. Only got 3 years in, but they're very serious about what they're doing. As is storytelling. And as I understand it, you don't read, you recite. You tell stories. And I know that, for example, I heard today the Mid-Island are really more geared to real, true stories and life stories and things like that. So it's about taking your life or whatever it is and telling the story. There's also some epic ones. Our first one we did of this, the lady did one about about Antarctica. And I've heard that story from different angles all the way through, but I sure was engaged with what she did, right? So that's the ability of what storytellers do, is to take that time and make it bring you in closely. So we're hoping you're all going to enjoy this. Our guest host tonight, the one who's going to be, as a matter of fact, she's in all three of these guilds, these folk things up and down the island, right? So she's very serious about it. Lee Porteous is going to get on stage, and she's going to be the one who's going to introduce each performer tonight. I think we have 5, including yourself, that are going to be up tonight telling stories. It's a wonderful thing to see happen. Thank you for coming out, for the audience that's here. And for those that are watching, you can still donate. Remember that this is all part of it's a bright idea. Not the most brightest financial idea, but it's a great idea. So anyway, we can help keep the showroom open to continue things like this. We sure would appreciate it. But right now, Lee, would you come on stage and take some time here and explain it? You're also the president right now of the Victoria team, right? Yep. Wow. So you're involved. You're not just one of these, oh, I want to try this. You're in there, right? Yeah. Lead parties, ladies and gentlemen. Take it away.
Well, and I have to say, we are very, very happy that Longevity John thought of us and thought of these special events. And he's given us the fourth Monday for last month, this month, November, and December. So hopefully this experiment will prove fruitful for all. And I would like to say that all storytellers, whether they're telling personal stories or stories of other kinds, we always say that all our stories are true. And some of them actually happened. So our first storyteller is Barbara Botham, and she's from the Mid-Island Storytellers, Parksville, and they have focused on personal stories. And if you would like to find out more about them, you just have to Google that. If you Google Storytelling Parksville, it'll come up. And Barb says that she's a poet by nature and a painter by heart. She moved to stories after that, and she's been a writer since she was a little girl. And she found that her stories have another life when they are told in her own voice. Her great-granny was a Carolyn from Nobber, and therefore Barbara's descended from the last bard of Ireland, Thurlow O'Carolan. This provides rather a high standard to live up to. But what could be more grand than to be descended from the last bard of Ireland and be a poet and a storyteller? Welcome, Barb.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The Mid-Island Storytellers, actually, one of the concerts that we do is called A Slice of Life. And this is a true story, personal, and told in the first person. And we do one or two of those in our year. And this is a story from that. A very short conversation with a ticket agent at the airport in Dublin almost wiped me off the face of Canada. When I emigrated to Canada from Ireland when I was 16 in the 1960s, it was just life unfolding. It was such a long time coming. I felt no real fuss was being made about this move. It was more of a coming together of a family. Instead of having the males on one side of the Atlantic and the females on the other. My father had gone first, and then the eldest boy, and then the next boy. And by the time my mother and we three girls went, we hadn't seen our father in 6 years. So, with all this to look forward to, it never struck me for 1 minute that I was actually leaving something. My community was far too entrenched to ever move. I had deep and strong roots there. And now I was off to set some more somewhere else. One day, I went to stay at my girlfriend's house, and the next day, a taxi picked me up, took my family and I on the long journey across the country to Shannon Airport. I took in the whole experience in my quiet way. The stop for lunch along the way, my first plane ride, the living map of Montreal as we came in on approach. Meeting my father again. Navigating a new household. Exploring a wonderful new neighborhood. And the happiness of a reunited family. This Canada was a wonderful place. The one thing that, though, I was not prepared for, the thing that did not feature in my adventure, was the unexpected heartache. I'd never had one before. For no good reason, my eyes would start to leak, and thank goodness it was a mild winter in Montreal and the precipitation was rain. I would quickly don my hooded school gabardine coat, go for a long walk in the rain, and let myself be drenched. It was the only way I could have the privacy of a good cry. My solid community in Dublin was inaccessible. At that time, in the 1960s, it took 2 days of hanging around the house, getting calls from the operator, the telephone operator, to arrange a very expensive undersea phone call on underseas. And I say underseas because they had cables going along the seabed under the Atlantic. And these cables were very old. And sometimes we could actually hear the sea through them, and we could hear the little critters that lived on them. And so it was quite poor quality too. So that wasn't happening. With each passing month, the pull on my heart grew stronger and stronger. With the shock, I realized it had refused to come with me. I had never thought to discuss this move with my heart. This was just what was happening, no deep thought required. Well, I'll just have to go back and do something about this. But first, I better do well in my secretarial course so I can earn some money. It took me 3 years to earn enough money to go home for a holiday. The ache was still there. My roots were still firmly entrenched in Irish soil, no matter how hard I tugged. The excitement of going home far exceeded any emotion I had on coming to Canada. I'm not normally an excitable person. More, I observe life with a quiet observation. I take delight in my everyday events. This excitement was new. And I knew just how much I had missed my friends when I arrived at the airport in Dublin. As soon as I spotted my friend and her family over there in the crowded airport, in public, I stood rooted to the spot and bawled my eyes out. "Welcome home," they said. After the wonderful 3 weeks of seeing all my old neighbors and friends and cousins, it was time to go back to the airport. And this time I had a big contingent of well-wishers to see me off. I went to check in. And at the check-in desk, I learned that there is a rule. You have to reconfirm your ticket 24 hours in advance, or it is assumed you are not flying. I knew nothing of this. It is the rule. I can ask the captain for you, but he may not be able to do anything. You should have reconfirmed. I ran back to my cousins and friends to tell them the good news. "I can't go. I have to stay. I didn't reconfirm my ticket. They're not letting me on." "You can't stay. What would you do?" asked my perturbed godmother. I'll get a job. I'll get an apartment. I live in Dublin. This is where I want to be. I've had my wonderful adventure in Canada. It is time to come home. My frightened godmother wondered what would she tell my mother. I was so excited, I was gushing out all my plans as they became clear to me right in the moment. "It'll be all right," I told her. "She knows I can look after myself. She has plenty to do over there. I'll start looking for work in the morning. The sooner I have a paycheck, the sooner I can have my apartment. On the many faces of my companions, there was consternation, amusement, pride, delight, fear, and worry. My heart was bursting with this stroke of good luck. It wasn't my fault. They wouldn't let me on, and I couldn't be happier. I was interrupted by the ticket agent telling me that the captain had okayed my ticket and I was free to board. "Oh, no, I'm not going now. I'm staying." No, said my godmother. "You had better take the seat and go back for now, and you can come back properly and we'll help you to get settled." The ticket agent was waiting for me to board the plane, and I had to make a decision. "You can stay," said my friend, who herself was also still a teenager. "You had best take the ticket and go back for now," say the wise elders. It was the impatient ticket agent who helped me to choose. I was beginning to cause a problem, and of course that would not do. I still had my sense of responsibility. I would go. I still had not saved up enough money to go back to Ireland again when, 2 years later, the roots began to loosen just enough to let me set some new ones down in Canada. And very soon, I was free to embrace all that Canada had to offer with a full and liberated heart. And embrace it I did. I love my fellow Canadians. I love being Canadian. Canada's been good to me and to my family. I've achieved much during my life in Canada, pursued many dreams. Yet, I sometimes wonder, did I do the right thing? I knew the language of my country. When I came to Canada, I had to learn a whole new version of English. I just wonder sometimes, what would life be like if I had taken that very tempting fork in my road?
The sound of that applause gladdens all our hearts who come up to these microphones. And I'm very glad that the ticket agent persuaded Barbara to be in Canada, as we've come to be friends through our storytelling, and I would miss her. Our next teller is Cindy Shantz, and she is mostly telling stories through the Around Town Tellers in Nanaimo. She loves to connect with people and has found that storytelling is perfect for that. She is a graduate of Margaret Murphy's introductory course and tells regularly the Around Town Tellers Stories for Friday in Nanaimo. Currently, she is not only writing and telling stories herself, but also teaching a small group of high school students named New Voices to do the same. So welcome, Cindy.
Boy, is it good to see real people out there. So much better than that little green circle on the computer when you're doing Zoom. So thank you for turning up. You know, I was thinking about where do most of my stories come from, and I realized that I travel a lot, and a lot of them come out of my travels, and that's no exception this evening. This one comes from a trip I made to the Bahamas almost 30 years ago. It's called Stranded. I'm in a motorboat with my husband, Peter, in the Caribbean, and 3 of our kids, Lucas, 17, Andrea, 14, and Beatrice, 7. We promised them a boat ride, but the boat we are in is nothing fancy. It was the last one left at Rico's Rentals. The seats are peeling, the paint is all peeling on them, and actually it's just that kind of boat that you get when it's the last one. I'm sitting in the middle with Andrea, and Lucas and Beatrice are in the front, and Peter's in the back steering the boat. I look back and I can see the white froth of the wake over him. Now, the engine's noisy, a little bit ratchety, but it seems just fine. And it's a perfect day. The sky's that kind of blue you only see on postcards. There is a breeze, but I can still feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. We have a late lunch, and I pass out paper plates. Peter turns the engine off. He says, I'd like to eat in peace. And we smile at each other because, you see, between the two of us, we have 6 kids, so peace is kind of rare. We start eating our lunch. We don't actually talk much. We just drift along, and we listen to the quiet slap of the water against the boat. The sea is so turquoise, it hurts my eyes. And when I look down, it's so clear I can see a long ways down. A school of tuna swims by, silvered by the sea. We're finished our lunch now, so we pack up and we're ready to head back. Peter pulls the cord on the motor, and it coughs, and then there's silence. So he pulls it again. Cough, silence. He squeezes the bulb to give it more gas, and then he yanks it again and again and again until I'm sure it's going to break. And then he takes both hands and gives it a big tug, and there's silence, no cough even. Bloody motor, he says. We're going to have to call Rico's and get help. He picks up the radio and punches the on button. Silence. So he does it again. He picks it up and he pushes the on button. He twirls some dials. No sound. Damn radio's not working either, he says. And he tosses it up into the front of the boat where it lies on the floor. Then he's very quiet. So quiet, I can hear his thoughts. We're in the tropics. Soon it will be dark. We have no radio, no lights, no flares. And we're drifting to a coral reef that I can see where the waves are crashing over it. For the first time since I've known Peter, he looks scared. I look around and look inland, and I notice that far away there's an island, and there seems to be something on it. It looks like one of those sprawling resorts. So I point to it and I say, I can swim to that island. He looks at me and says, well, I guess that's the only choice we have. You know that I can't swim. I sink like a rock after a few feet. Lucas says, well, I could swim. But I kind of smile at him because he's not a distant swimmer. I am. I've been swimming length since I was a kid. Not fast, mind you, just slow and steady. So the decision's made. Peter reaches into the beach bag and hands me my mask and snorkel. I put on the snorkel gear. No life jacket. It would be too awkward to swim in. It would just slow me down. And besides, it's salt water. I can float easily. I'm ready to leave the boat now. Beatrice comes and gives me a big hug, and then she goes over to the side of the boat, leans over, and starts looking at fish, her long blonde hair shielding her face. She has no idea the danger we're in. Lucas tries to act cool. He pulls his baseball cap down over his head, and supposedly to keep the sun out of his eyes. Andrea comes and gives me a great big hug. Peter reaches under his seat and gets my flip-flops and says, I'll tie these to the back of your bathing suit. I look a bit baffled. And he says, you know, there could be some sharp rocks and some shells on that beach. And then he adds, and when you get there, could you wave, please? Let us know you're there. And then he says, and I'll try to anchor the boat with Lucas. That is, if we have enough rope and if the water's not too deep. Well, I'm ready to go, so I climb up on the prow and I hold my mask tightly to my face and I jump off. As I'm swimming away from the boat, I start to worry. I'm worried about Peter and Lucas. Will they be able to anchor the boat? And if I get to the island, will I be able to find someone to help me? And even if I do, will I be too late? I start to swim faster, keep my legs pumping up and down. I swim like this for some time, and then suddenly, I'm swimming and not going anywhere at all. It's like in one of those dreams, where you're running away from something scary and you can't move. I keep trying to swim, but I'm in a current. I take a deep breath, and then I kick harder, and then I swim all my might, pulling the water behind me. Slowly, I move forward. I'm out of the current and into the calm. I keep swimming this way for a while, and then decide I'm a bit tired, so I stop and tread water and look around. All I can see is blue water, blue sky. And then way out in the distance, I see the island, much further away than I thought. What was I thinking of? I might never make it to shore. Maybe I'll sink and no one will ever see me again. Maybe my family will. I can do this. If I don't swim to shore and get a boat and someone to help us, my family could die. They could be smashed on that reef. I start swimming faster, harder, hauling the water behind me. I keep this up until I'm really tired again. And then I tread water, look around, and the island's much closer. And then I start swimming again. I think, I just keep doing this. I'm going to get there. After a while, I think I can relax now. So I do, and it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. I just go along and listen to the steady breathing and hear the flop of the water, and also I just feel that warm water gliding by me. I gaze down through my mask at the water and through sunlight streaking through it. And that's when I see it. A dark shape looming beneath me, moving at the same speed as I am. Oh my God, why hadn't I remembered? Bahamian waters are known to be home to all sorts of sharks. Tiger sharks, hammerheads, bull sharks. I remain still. Sharks can sense the slightest vibration. They attack people in distress. I wonder if the shark beneath me can hear my heart beating. I wish I could stop breathing yet still stay alive. A slight current moves me forward. The shark moves too. I will the shark to swim away. Slowly, it starts to move, moves ahead of me, and disappears. I remain still for a while. Then, still floating, I'm not going to tread water and have my legs dangling. I look around, and suddenly I know what fear can do to you. The sun's rays are slanting over the water and moving as it gets later. It wasn't a shark below me. It was my shadow. It was my shadow that was moving and going forward and disappeared. I start swimming again. It seems like ages before I finally stop and tread water and look around and, oh my gosh, I can see the beach now. Palm trees, shutters on the resort. I swim as hard as I can, stop, and my toes touch bottom. I stumble through knee-deep water, and I land up on the beach and a heap on the shore. After I drag myself to my feet, I turn around and I wave to where I think the boat might be. But all I can see is blue. I've got to get help now. I walk up to the resort and I pull open the brass handle, at least I try to, but the door is locked. The shutters are all closed too. But on the patio, there's some deck chairs, and on the table there's a half-filled glass. There's not a soul in sight, though. How can that be? I look around and I see a stony path leading away from the resort where maybe there's some people. So I start to walk along the path in my flip-flops, and I think, thank you, Peter. These stones would be hell on bare feet. The path is pretty, though. It's bordered by shrubbery and palm trees. I gaze up through the palm trees at shreds of pink sky. The sun is setting. Moments later, it's dark. But luckily, a slice of moon lights up the stones in front of me. So I keep walking. A little while later, I round a bend and hear the crunch of footsteps approaching me. A beam of light flashes in the dark. "Oh my God, you scared me," says the man, aiming the flashlight at me. He's scared. I'm terrified. He towers above me. I'm conscious I'm only wearing a bathing suit. "What are you doing here alone in the dark?" he says, shaking his head. I notice he's wearing shorts and a tropical shirt and a straw hat, and he seems not frightening. I mean, he seems okay, and he seems concerned about me. So I tell him my situation. He introduces himself as Gary, and then he says, "Are you aware that you just swam through a stretch of shark-infested water?" "No," I say, and he shakes his head again. He tells me there's a big festival on in town, and then he tells me that he will take me in his boat to our boat and see if he can fix the engine. I follow him to the dock where his boat is tied up, and then we get on. We're speeding across the ocean in Gary's boat when I'm still worried. I wonder if Peter and Lucas managed to anchor the boat. Even if they did, would we actually see them in the dark? Maybe we've already passed them. Did I really swim this far? Gary keeps asking me how much further it is, and I keep saying, I don't know. Suddenly, I see a flicker of light way in the distance, and then it dies. And then another flicker. We head toward it at top speed. See another flicker. As we get closer, it's Peter holding up something flaming to attract our attention. Moments later, we reach the boat, and we rope Gary's boat to ours and climb in. "Thank God you're back," says Peter, giving me a big hug. And thank God for paper plates, they burn beautifully. Lucas grins from under the hoodie he's now wearing. Andrea wraps her arms around me. And Beatrice, well, she says nothing. She's curled up on the floor, fast asleep under her panned bear towel. Gary manages to fix the boat, something to do with the choke, and then he starts to escort us back to the boat rental. And as we chug along behind him, I look around at my family, and I feel that I'm the luckiest person in the world. Thank you.
Well, crossroads are where you find them. Airports, the middle of the ocean. And I hope that your high school students who are learning to tell stories are watching this. And if they aren't, I think you should set this YouTube video as homework for them. I think they could learn a lot. Our next teller is Jennifer Ferris, and she's from the Victoria Storytellers Guild. She's been telling stories for over 30 years and is a story coach and workshop facilitator. She is also past president of our national organization, Storytellers of Canada, Contour de Canada. I have been listening to her stories for years, and I believe that Jennifer can tell any kind of story to any kind of audience in any kind of venue. She's recently was a featured teller in an American festival, and last month was exuberantly telling stories in backyards all over her neighborhood for a street festival. She has a deep interest in facilitating new voices, especially shy ones, to begin storytelling. Tonight, she's going to introduce you to someone she admires.
Well, in this time of COVID, Lee and I thought that we would lift the mood by telling stories about cholera. In the mid-1840s, Queen Victoria ordered that a silver teapot be made and inscribed with the words, the Queen Dowager, and the Ladies of Liverpool to Catherine Wilkinson, 1846. Why on earth would the Queen of England be interested in a small, nondescript woman, an Irish immigrant who lived in the slums of Liverpool? Well, Catherine, Kitty, was born in Londonderry, Ireland, in 1786. Her family were poor. Ireland of those days was divided between the rich English landowners and the rural poor, the Irish. It was hard to make a living. There was political unrest at the time, and this drove many people away from the land of their birth. Kitty's parents decided that they would move to Liverpool, a thriving city on the west coast of England, across the Irish Sea. So when Kitty was 9 years old, she and her family boarded a ship early one February morning with enough food and enough water for the 200-mile trip across the sea. They couldn't pay for a cabin, so they spent their time on deck. Kitty and her younger brother ran about playing and exploring, while their mother found a sheltered place and nursed her newborn baby. Father enjoyed the view. It was a sunny morning. The wind was singing a sweet song, and they were on their way. But the following morning, the wind was singing a different song. It was howling. The sky was gray. The sea was churning, angry. Everyone was afraid. As they approached the mouth of the Mersey River, which was the way that you found the port of Liverpool, the captain was concerned. The mouth of the river had dangerous, unseen sandbanks that had brought many a ship to disaster. He would have to make his way very carefully in the storm. Just as he was about to enter the river, the force of the wind broke the mast, and the little ship was out of control. They drifted away, south, towards Hole Bank, a very dangerous place. A lifeboat was launched from the town of Formby, and just as it was reaching the wreck, now on a sandy bed, the waves broke the spine of the ship. Many people fell into the water. Kitty, her younger brother, her mother holding the baby, scrambled into the lifeboat. Father was nowhere to be seen. Just as that little rowboat was pulling away from the wreck, a great wave cast itself across the little craft, snatching the baby from her mother's arms. Later that day, the bedraggled terrified family arrived in Liverpool. They were country people, rural people, used to village life, and here they were in a city. Liverpool was a burgeoning city. It made its profits from shipbuilding, slavery, and the oil trade or the whale trade of the whaling industry was at its peak at that time, and the stink of whale oil from the refining factories on Queen's Dock permeated every corner of every house in the city. The streets were narrow and crooked. There were piles of garbage here and there. Every seventh house was a tavern to provide accommodation and amusement for the sailors that came off the slave ships. Despite the fact that she had lost her husband, lost her baby, Mrs. Seward, Kitty's mother, found them a place to live in a cellar. Now, in those days, the houses were cellar, ground floor, and upper floor. Business and professional people lived on the upper floor. Commerce and business was conducted on the ground floor. And the cellars, dark, dingy places with poor air, crowded, were rented to the poor people who were streaming into Liverpool. The population of Liverpool doubled from 1760 to 1800, and then doubled again from 1800 to 1830. It was hard to find a place to live. Kitty's mother pulled herself together. She had to find work, and she did, in domestic servants, a job for herself and Kitty. They went to the house of Mrs. Lightbody. Immediately, their employer recognized that Kitty's mother had a lot to offer. She could read and write, and she was beautiful at spinning and lace making, and Mrs. Lightbody used her to teach her other employees. Kitty went out with Mrs. Lightbody every day, almost, as Mrs. Lightbody did her charitable work. So Kitty learned reading and writing, spinning and lace work from her mother, and she learned the importance of looking out for those who have less than we do, for the poor. Things were going well, too well. Kitty's mother fell ill. She lost her job and was put into an asylum for the insane. Kitty and her brother were left alone, and they came under the parish. They were the responsibility of the parish. There were two choices. Either they would go into the workhouse, or they would be indentured laborers in a cotton mill. The parish didn't want the expense of these two children, and so, at the age of 11, Kitty was made to sign indentured papers which would commit Kitty and her brother to 10 years of unpaid servitude, completely the property of a mill owner. The cotton industry was a cornerstone of slavery. It ate up thousands of children. We may admire the great country houses of England, but those houses and the wealth of their occupants relied heavily on the proceeds of slavery and the work, the injury, and the death of many small children. Kitty and her brother worked 6 12-hour work days a week in return for board and lodging and inadequate clothing. Caton Mill was not as bad as some, and for Kitty and her brother, they really appreciated the fact that Caton Mill was in the countryside, and so between the factory and the place where they slept, they could walk in the fresh air and hear birdsong. At the end of the 10 years, Kitty was 21, and she returned to Liverpool because she had heard that her mother had been released from the asylum and was living somewhere in Liverpool in terrible circumstances. She found her mother and rented a large room because Kitty thought, I'll start a school, a dame's school. She made a small place in the corner of the room for a bed for her mother and herself, and the rest of the room was available to the students. Every day, Kitty had between 10 and 90 students. The poor did not have many choices when it came to education. She would teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, and her mother although almost blind, would sit on the bed and do her lacework. Kitty charged the families 3 pennies a week. Things were going well. Too well. Her mother's health began to go downhill. She became very unpredictable. Kitty might return from an errand and to find her mother had burned their clothing, their bedding, their food, and she frightened the children. And so Kitty had to close the school. She lost the lovely room and moved back to a cellar with her mother. Now she couldn't go back to domestic service, couldn't leave her mother alone, and so she did what the very poorest in Liverpool did for a living. At 2 a.m. in the morning, when her mother was still asleep, Kitty would get up, scours the streets of Liverpool for horse dung, which she would sell to the farmers. But every time she turned around, she saw someone who was worse off than herself. And so if she had a little extra food, she would share it. If she heard that someone's mother was ill, she would go into the house and she would nurse the patient. She'd look after the frightened children. But her youth was passing her by. Then when she was 27 years old, she met Emmanuel de Montet, a French sailor. They married. She quickly gave birth to a baby boy, John, and was immediately pregnant again. De Montet, we don't know if he disappeared or was drowned, but he was never seen again and never saw the birth of his second son. You might think that Kitty, now with the care of a mother and 2 tiny children, might have slipped into a sea of despair. But that wasn't Kitty's way. In the cellar next door, there was a partially blind old woman who said she'd keep an eye on the family when Kitty went out to work. And so Kitty found a job in a nail factory some 10 minutes' walk from their home. The work was hard, hot, dangerous. Every day she would come home with her hands burned and blistered. But now she had money, and they were able to move out of the cellar and into a house on Denison Street. Things were going well. Too well. Kitty couldn't work at the factory anymore. It was too hard. And so she had to stay home with her family, and she went back to collecting horse manure once more. She found part-time job as a domestic servant when she could, and friends from her church gave her flowers from their garden that she could sell at the marketplace on Saturday. And one of the families that she worked for gave her a mangle. That's like giving somebody a washing machine today. And so she could set herself up as, she would have called herself a washerwoman, but we'll call her a laundress. And things began to look up. And that's when she met Thomas Wilkinson. He was walking down the road one day when he heard a sweet voice singing an old Lancashire song, and it reminded him of his childhood. He went in search of the singer, found Kitty. They courted, and they married. Now, Kitty was quite a catch. She had a good head on her shoulders, and she had a house on Denison Street, and she had a mangle. Thomas was a good catch. He was 9 years younger than Kitty. He was strong, he had broad shoulders, and a good job as a labourer in a warehouse. Things were looking good. Too good. Death knocked at Kitty's door and took away her youngest son. But there was no time to despair, for cholera that had been marching through the country, slipping into every city, wormed its way into Liverpool. In 1833, 5,000 people contracted cholera. The rich blamed the poor. Well, their irregular habits, their intemperance. It was their fault. But some people began to realize that there was a connection between disease and living conditions. Perhaps overcrowding, poor ventilation, and the lack of water might have something to do with the spread of disease. Kitty thought so, and she said to her neighbors that cleanliness can be a weapon against disease. She had Thomas put in a copper boiler in her kitchen so that she could heat water. She invited her neighbors to bring their bedding, their clothing to her house and do their laundry there. She taught them how to use chloride of sulfur to disinfect. She had Thomas put up a line outside in their garden that they might dry the clothes, the bedding in sun and wind. "And don't you be putting on your clothes until they're dry," advised Kitty. Many people died of cholera in Liverpool through those years, but not one single fatality on Denison Street. Of course, there was illness all around them. Fearless of infection, Kitty would go into the homes of cholera victims and she would nurse them. She would look after their children while the parents were ill. When the children were orphaned, she took them into her own house. There were at one time 20 orphans in her bedroom, and they became the basis for the South Corporation Infant School. She gave clean bedding and blankets to her friends if they had nothing of their own. She was very concerned with education, so those little children that came to her house were taught to read and write. She prepared the girls for domestic service. She prepared the boys for apprenticeships or perhaps a life as a seaman. She received no money, although the council did allow her not to pay her poor tax. Imagine the poor having to pay the poor tax. Thomas said, "I could eat less. I could work more hours if it would help." But Kitty said that wasn't necessary, for she was a good manager. People began to clean up their houses, clean up the streets, get rid of the garbage, and that is how they saved themselves from cholera and death. Well, everything that Kitty was doing and the wash house that she was operating in her kitchen came to the attention of a certain William Rathbone. He was from a Quaker family. He was a rich and very successful businessman in Liverpool, and he was a philanthropist and worked tirelessly to improve the lot and conditions of the poor. He could see that thousands of people were still coming in to live in Liverpool for the work in the iron foundries, the chemical yards, the paint factories, and all the other industries that were crowding the city. People coming all the time. Where would they live? And so the city built these tenement-like buildings, small dwellings for each family. But water was a problem. Sometimes as many as 80 families had to share a tap. And then there were the cesspits. Still, Kitty preached, "Cleanliness is a weapon against disease." Well, she met William. He took a liking to her. He admired what she was doing. He introduced her to his wife. They became fast friends. And for the next 10 years, Kitty and William lobbied the Liverpool municipal government to build a wash and bath house for the poor. William wrote a pamphlet about Kitty, and it was distributed all over the country, hoping that other cities would also open wash and bath houses. At last, they were successful in Liverpool. A bath house was built on Upper Frederick Street and quickly renovated to accommodate washing facilities for clothes. William said, "Who better to be superintendents of this new facility than Kitty and Thomas Wilkinson?" The council agreed. That was the same year that the mayor of Liverpool invited Kitty to come to a special ceremony where she was presented a silver teapot from the Queen. "How would the Queen know about me?" said Kitty. Well, apparently one of those pamphlets that William Rathbone had written about Kitty and her work had fallen into the hands of a member of the royal family who'd showed it to the Queen. And the Queen said, "I believe that a silver teapot with an inscription would be most perfect." Thomas died in the late 1840s, but Kitty carried on as superintendent of the wash and bath house. She and William came up with a a description of what a wash and bath house should be. A large washroom on the ground floor, a large room with hot water pipes to dry between 300 and 400 bundles of laundry each week. A yard so that clothing and bedding might be dried outside. There should be a large room with good windows on both sides for ventilation for a washing facility so that people could come and wash their bodies. There would be a partition down the middle so that the women could bathe on one side and the men could bathe on the other at any hour of the day. A reading room and a nursery. Kitty retired at the age of 60, but she didn't stop working. She just moved down Upper Frederick Street a few houses and became a housekeeper in a boarding house. In her spare moments in the afternoon, she would take a cup of tea in the front room and watch people walking up and down the street with great bundles of laundry on their heads. It would make her smile. Her son, John, and his family had moved away, so she was alone in Liverpool, and as her health failed, she relied on the kindness of friends. When she died, she was buried in St. Catherine's graveyard behind the cathedral in Liverpool, but she wasn't forgotten. Every 10 or 15 years, there'd be an article about her in one of the newspapers. One of the Rathbone families wrote a book about her. In 1912, a stained glass window with her image was installed in the Ladies' Chapel in Liverpool Cathedral. And in 2012, she entered St. George's Hall, a large edifice in Liverpool celebrating with statues important men of the Victorian and Edwardian times, important men in white marble all around the room, and only one woman. In Italian white marble, there she is, in her work clothes, apron, a mop cap, her arthritic hands pushing her sleeves up, ready for hard work. Kitty Wilkinson. The graveyard where she was laid to rest was cleared of its gravestones in the 1960s so that area could be a park. Only one gravestone remains in place. On the gravestone are these words: Catherine Wilkinson died 1860 at the age of 73. Self-denying, she was the widow's friend, the support of the orphan, the unwearied nurse of the sick, originator of the bath and wash house for the poor. There is a small snippet from the Gospel of St. Mark. For they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even her living. Kitty Wilkinson.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's almost by chance that we both found people of interest in that area that we admired and wanted to bring forward. This is a story that I call Dr. Snow, the Broad Street Pump, Cholera, and the Ghost Map. If I don't cover any of those, you get your money back. From 1831 through 1854, 4 major cholera epidemics swept through London. Tens of thousands lost their lives. Now, cholera, we know today, is quite a simple illness. You get it by drinking water that's contaminated by human waste, and you suffer terrible vomiting and terrible, terrible diarrhea. Cholera kills people by dehydration. Even your blood will turn a darker red for the lack of water in it. It's very simple to cure. All you need is lots of water and electrolytes like salt. If you are treated in that way, you have a 99% chance of surviving cholera. Now, in these years in London, and if untreated, you have a 50-50 chance of surviving. If, however, you fell into the hands of the medical profession during those years in London, your chances of survival were 30%. Why would this be? Well, because the medical profession had a singular way of thinking about human beings and disease, the causes, and the treatment. And this dated back to the 6th century BC from a person named Hippocrates. The Hippocratic Oath comes from him. And Hippocrates had a grand idea. And his idea was that disease was not caused by the gods. What then caused it? Well, he felt that disease was a lack of balance in the human being. And the factors that affected that balance were great things in the outdoors like weather, geography, topography, and individually human beings with various factors, let's call them, humors and such, in a very complicated relationship and completely individual, no two human beings alike. And so the same cures did not necessarily apply because these things required the balance and an individual treatment. In the 2nd century AD, a physician named Galen wrote 10,000 pages explaining this whole theory. And those pages and all that was done in aid of them and inspired by them for all the centuries afterwards were still in play. And Western medicine depended upon these ideas, and all doctors were trained in these ideas right up until perhaps the end of the 1800s. And so, when they saw somebody with cholera, what did they think caused cholera? Well, cholera was caused, in their view, by bad odors. They called them miasmas. And they were breathed in, and they were a poison. And the symptoms of the disease, the vomiting and the diarrhea, were the body's way of getting rid of this poison. And so to help the body continue to do that, they would give patients a compound of mercury that was toxic to make them vomit more. And they would let the blood out so that the poisons would get out. And of course, what that meant is people were even more dehydrated, and their chances of survival went down. Now, in 1813, Jon Snow was born. Not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, but the person who became Dr. Jon Snow. And he was from a humble family. His father was a laborer, but his parents could tell that their little boy was brilliant. Brilliant, hardworking, serious. And they scraped together the money to give him an education, and he became a doctor. The first wave of cholera through London, he would have been only a teenager. But he certainly saw it later as a doctor. And the one that came through in 1848 made a big impression on him. And what he I think, because he was a bit of an outsider, although he'd worked his way up, he was president of the Medical Society in London, and he was a scientist. And his interest particularly was in anesthetics, in particular chloroform. Now, chloroform is a very dangerous thing, although it's effective. And he used to use himself as a subject for his experiments. And he developed particular medical equipment that will allow chloroform to be used for patients. And he took no patents out so that everybody could have access to this equipment. And indeed, Queen Victoria called on his services for the delivery of her last 2 babies. So he was a person of some significance in the medical community. But because he knew that when you breathe things in, they affected your lungs, but cholera had to do with your gut, he thought the way you get contaminated with cholera is through your mouth. Now, the situation in London for water in those days was that there are many, many shallow wells, but there were also companies that provided water through pipes. Now, these companies drew their water from the Thames. Some of the companies drew their water from higher up the Thames, Others drew them from lower down below where the sewage outlets were. Now, in those days, it was the bad smell that the doctors, the medical people, and all of the officials believed was the cause of cholera, not the sewage. So you could drink the sewage, no problem, but you didn't want to smell that sewage. So nobody really took any interest in where these pipes were that brought the water in. But Dr. Snow did, and he had the idea that he might be able to discover and prove the source of cholera. So he took it upon himself to pick out a couple of companies on each side of the divide, above the sewage, below the sewage. This was quite a task because it was a Byzantine series of pipes, and he had to find out where they all went, who lived there, and then match them up with the people who had died in the previous year of cholera. And what he found was the people who drank the water from below the sewage outlet were 8 times more likely to die of cholera than the ones from above. Now, you and I would think that was pretty conclusive proof. But because he was also a fairly prominent figure, he brought it forward, and there was a study commissioned. And this study, it was 300 pages long, 352 appendices, color plates and diagrams. And its conclusion, it was impossible to doubt that the main contagion, although there might be something that relates to the water, the main contagion was the air. So there we were. Now, in 1854, a cholera epidemic started to break out in Soho. Soho was right on Dr. Snow's doorstep practically. He heard about it on Sunday, September 3rd. But it had started probably Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And people were now fleeing the area, and people were dying, left, right, and center. And so what he decided to do is to look into it now. And he, of course, believed that it was in the water. So he began checking that water, and he tried to get somebody else to help him through the microscope and check on that, and they couldn't really determine it. But he immediately, as soon as the doors opened on Monday, began collecting data on where everybody lived and who was dying of cholera. And he went door to door to door. And he created a map. And in the history of science, this is probably the most famous map that exists. And over the years, it got the name the Ghost Map, probably because it showed where people died. Well, he was a very thorough man, and there were all of these wells, and he put them on the map, and he looked at where people died in relation to those wells. And more it was clear that it was around the Broad Street well. He had help in his endeavor. There was a young clergyman named Reverend Whitehead, Henry Whitehead, who knew everybody in the parish, and he liked Dr. Snow. He liked his matter-of-fact and scientific approach to things, and he decided to help him, and he was a huge help. Well, by Wednesday, Dr. Snow was convinced, and the evidence on his map was not complete, but it showed that these fatalities were occurring around the Broad Street pump and not the others. And he had enough evidence that when the guardians of the district were called together for a meeting on the Thursday night, the 7th of September, he put it to them that they had to take the handle off the Broad Street pump so nobody else could be infected by that water. Well, Reverend Whitehead was there, and he said that no one in that room, including him, believed Dr. Snow. He was helping to gather evidence because he thought he could prove his theory, which was divine intervention. But he was an honest man and would follow the evidence. But the council, because to placate Dr. Snow, they agreed to have the handle taken off the pump. But they knew it had nothing to do with the water, it had to do with the smells. So they had lime scattered in the street. And it seemed like the infection was dying down a bit by that point. So they took apart the Broad Street pump and they looked. And they could not see any damage in the bricks around the well. And they were told by the city architect that there indeed was a sewage line, but it was underneath the well. It could not have contaminated the well. But Dr. Snow was sure. He was sure. But where was the link? So he and the reverends continued with their investigation. And what they found was that places like there was a workhouse, 30 people lived there. 5 people died. But they had a separate source of water. They didn't use the well. There was a brewery, 70 employees. They didn't get cholera. They drank the beer. There was a restaurant in the area. 9 patrons died there. They used the water from the well. There was a dental supply place there. All 7 of the employees died. They drank the water from that well. There were 3 children. They didn't live right around the area, but that was their route to go to school, and they drank the water from the well. You might think, why is this happening? Well, for some reason, the Broad Street well had a reputation of having particularly tasty water, and so people drank that water. There was an old woman who lived 3 miles away who died of cholera. How did that happen? Well, it happened this way. She used to live near the Broad Street pump. She loved the water, and she sent her servant every day to get a jug of that water. He brought it home, and she and her niece drank that water, and both died. And so you could see that he'd filled in the gaps in the map. And this map, the ghost map, we would have said was conclusive proof. And indeed, these days, it's thought to be the very first mapping in epidemiology. Dr. Fauci is an epidemiologist, so Dr. Snow was his predecessor. So what happened after this was that Parliament decided that they would put through a law, and the law would ban, crack down on at least, all the smelly businesses in the area. Now, there were lots of smells, let me tell you. And one of the problems was the cesspools. Now, there were 200,000 cesspools in London. There were pipes that ran sewer away, and especially since rich people had discovered flush toilets, and it was quite a fad. So there were more demand for pipes taking the sewage into the ocean, into the Thames. Anyway, these cesspools worked pretty well for a long time. They were in the basements of houses. They were in their yards, very close by. And they were maintained by the city. And what would happen is they would take all the sewage out of these cesspools. They would take them by wagon out to the edge of the city and sell it to the farmers for fertilizer, kind of like the horse dung. And then they would use the money to continue on carting this sewage away, but also to repair the cesspools. Now, what happened was the city exploded in population, and it grew. As it grew, the farmers were further and further away, and it was less and less economical to ship the cesspool effluent out to them. And then, I think it was 1847, guana, mountains of it, was discovered in South America, and this was way cheaper for the farmers for fertilizer than trucking the stuff from the cesspools. And so they fell into disuse. Now, people, they might haul it out themselves and throw it into the Thames, or they would throw it into the street, along with bodies of dead animals and other garbage. So it was a smelly place anyway, but there were businesses that were particularly bad. So Parliament was deciding they would deal with this because, of course, it's the smells that matter. And Dr. Snow was called as one of the witnesses before the parliamentary committee. And despite being hounded in his testimony, he refused to agree that it was the smells. Even if it's the kind of smell that makes you double over and gag, Dr. Snow said, no, it's the water. Well, the bill went through, and the Lancet, which was even then a very prestigious medical journal, excoriated Dr. Snow and accused him of betraying the public by not agreeing of what the actual cause of cholera was. Well, Dr. Snow had other things to do. He had his own patients, but he also wanted to continue his work with respect to the chloroform in his studies, and he began working on his magnus opus. And 4 years later, in 1858, June 10th, he was just putting the final touches, let's say, on his manuscript. And he was thrown to the floor with a massive stroke, and he died 6 days later at age 45. Now, in some ways it's too bad he died in June, because later that summer, the cure for this problem with the water and cholera occurred. And it occurred because of what the press called the big stink. And the big stink happened because of a combination of weather events. And they were that there was a drought, so the Thames was really low, and all of that sewage that was plastered against its banks was exposed. And then there was a heat wave. And there was the mother of all miasmas coming from the Thames. And the Parliament buildings only recently had been built along the banks. Well, now we have the members of Parliament, the House of Lords, and the Supreme Court. All the poobahs in the city are now terrified because of this terrible smell. It has to be dealt with. So finally, they appropriate the money and hire the overseer, and the sewage system was all changed and rebuilt so that the nasty smells from the sewage were carried down below London. So they solved the miasma problems and inadvertently actually solved the cholera problem, because that's where the sewage went. Now, one of the things I forgot to tell you was that the Reverend Whitehead carried on with the investigations. And what he discovered was that in March of the next year, he found a note of the death of a baby. It wasn't listed as cholera, but all the symptoms were cholera. Sarah Lewis's 5-month baby died on the 2nd of September. He remembered it, but he hadn't connected it. So he went to interview her. And what he found was that her baby had fallen ill, probably the Wednesday or the Thursday before it died on the Saturday the 2nd. And she had washed all of its nappies and its filthy clothes, and with the wastewater, she took it down and she dumped it into a cesspool through its chute in the front yard. A cesspool. She lived at 40 Broad Street. That cesspool was less than 3 feet from the Broad Street pump. So he also found that her husband had died of cholera too, and he came down with it on the 8th of September, the very day that the handle of the Broad Street pump was taken off. Had she, and she would have washed his clothes and dumped it in that cesspool, and had that handle still been on the pump, there would have been a resurgence of cholera in that area. So it was Dr. Snow's intervention that saved many lives just in that area. But now they had a reason to look again at the connection between the Broad Street pump and the cholera. And when they dug out the cesspool, they found that it was defective, and the effluent was not going into the sewage system. It was leaking through the dirt over to the Broad Street pump. And they found, when they looked at the walls from this direction, there was clearly cracks in the walls, and it got into the Broad Street pump. Now you would think, wouldn't you, that this was case closed, done like dinner, clear. But it was not. And it was not until approaching the end of the century, that people began to look again through the microscope at the water. Now, the doctors had known about this Dutch guy's invention, and they'd seen the little animalcules in the water, but they never believed that things like that could affect a human being in all its complexity, and whose disease was dependent upon all its internal factors and balance. So it wasn't until Louis Pasteur and some others began to show that diseases of animals and of human beings were caused by that the whole tenor of the medical profession changed. Now, there might be some of us who think that a holistic idea of us and doctors treating us holistically might be a good thing. Well, that depends on what they include in it. So, with respect to Dr. Snow, as you can tell, he is a bit of a hero for me. And it may be that those crossroads that society was presented with were not taken. Reminds me of Yogi Berra saying, well, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Anyway, and so it is that Dr. Snow is remembered as the father of epidemiology, and his map that he created is famous in science as the ghost map, although you would never guess that. But I wanted you to make the acquaintance of Dr. Snow. And I think Dr. Fauci has had some of his same problems. And so our last teller is Margaret Murphy. She's been storytelling for 23 years. And she first came to storytelling because she saw a poster for a festival in Toronto. And she walked on in and has been telling ever since. She is also a workshop facilitator and a trainer of storytellers. She has done a number of one-woman shows when she finds women that she admires as well. Most recently, Georgia O'Keeffe, which she was able to do on Zoom to great effect. And we're hoping that other people will get to hear her too. She's a founding member of the Around Town Tellers, and I've changed my thing here. She says she recently was thrilled to be sharing in the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the Canadian Federation of University Women, Nanaimo. Because you know, when you're a storyteller and you love to tell, you find places to do it. And so we're very happy to have this opportunity to hear Margaret Murphy tonight.
Well, that was dear. Thank you so much, Lee. Places to tell in this remarkable place. Thank you to you, Longevity John, for this great space, and to Tim for all your work here also, and to you for coming out. We're most appreciative that you came out, and to you at home, in your part of the world, as you share in this storytelling experience. Crossroads is the theme. You know, when I think of Crossroads, many ideas come to mind. And I think of possibility. I think of choices. And I also think that eventually Crossroads may lead to community and connection. And all of these elements take shape and some kind of form in the story I have for you. And the title is Kindred Spirits. I have a wish list. Every year, I seem to add items on that wish list. And when the COVID dust settles, I hope to travel again, far and wide. And one day, with my beloved husband Noel, I'd like to travel to the south of Ireland, to County Cork, and I will make my way with him to the town of Middleton. And from Middleton, we will wind our way outside the village to Bailick Park. And as we wander through Bailick Park, we will find that grove of rowan trees. And there by the river is this extraordinary structure. It is great and round and reaching up high to the sky. The great disk in the ground represents the difficulties and the troubles of the Irish famine. But surrounded by this disk and holding it up, supporting it, are these extraordinary steel feathers, that rise high, high, 7 meters, 20 feet up into the sky. Kindred Spirits, it is called. The disc does represent indeed the difficulties the Irish had many years ago. And the feathers, well, they represent the strength, the resilience, the support that was given to the Irish by the Choctaw community of the United States. Now, you well may ask, what is the connection between the Irish and the Choctaw? Well, for that, we need to go back almost 200 years. In 1831, Andrew Jackson was President of the United States, and he initiated the Indian Removal Act. Yes, that's right, the Indian Removal Act. And what that did was remove the indigenous peoples, many of them, hundreds of thousands of them in fact, from their ancestral homeland and move them to what was then called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. My focus tonight is on a particular group, and is the Choctaw. But they were not alone in this great forced migration. The Seminole, the Cherokee, and many others. But in 1831, that fall and winter into 1832, 6,000 Choctaw were forced to leave their ancestral lands, their homes, and to walk to Oklahoma. For some, this was 600, 800, 1,000 miles away. One of the chiefs referred to it as the Trail of Tears. I think of it as this trail of sorrows because 1/3 of the Choctaw, 1/3, that's 2,000 members of the community, perished on that forced migration. Perished due to the cold and due to starvation and hardship. But the community survived, and they made it to Oklahoma, and they rebuilt not only their homes, but their lives. Their resilience is phenomenal. And I think of my own former sister-in-law, Joyce, who is a descendant of the proud Choctaw in Oklahoma. Across the waters, far across the waters, the Irish were undergoing their own great difficulties. Well, their tumultuous history is perhaps known to you. But in the mid-19th century, under British rule, the Irish were suffering terribly. The Great Potato Famine started in 1847, otherwise known as the Great Famine. And 1 million men, women, children in Ireland perished from starvation and disease. Another 1 million fled the country, desperate to survive. Jack Murphy, my great-grandfather, was amongst that group who came to the Ottawa Valley. The others that remained were relegated to some barren land where they had to rely on potato farming. But when things couldn't get much worse, a fungus descended upon the potato crops, and 2/3 of the crops were destroyed. When the Irish turned to the British for help, they asked the famine relief minister, "Please, our children are dying." And he was heard to say to his cronies, "Well, perhaps this is just one way of cleansing a population. After all, we are dealing with the perverse, turbulent Irish." Oh, the Irish felt abandoned. And yet they were not entirely. Across the water, our beloved Choctaw heard of the plight of their Irish brothers and sisters. They who just a dozen years earlier had gone through their own incredible oppression and misery heard of the story, and they said, "How can we help?" The Choctaw chiefs gathered and said, "We need to rally the community. Yes, we can offer our prayers and our good wishes, but how can we help?" And they came up with $170. $170, which, for those of you who are interested, would be about $5,000 today. The current Choctaw counselor is Delton Cox, and he said, "Oh, we remember. We well remember the plight of our brothers and sisters." He speaks of the event as if it had happened this morning. He said, we were poor, but that was our nature, to reach out and help those in need. And the Irish received this money through the Quaker Relief Fund. They came and distributed the funds throughout Ireland. And the Irish, well, they wept. They wept in gratitude that this group who had gone through so much themselves would turn and support them. In 2015, they thought, we need to be able to explain and honor these people. How can we remember the Choctaw? And so Alex Pentek was an artist in Cork, and he was asked to create a memorial. And Alex Pentek listened to the story, and he talked to the Irish, and he met with the Choctaw, and he put together this remarkable piece, 10 pieces, the great empty bowl on the base, with 9 magnificent stainless steel feathers that wave up to the sky in love and in support, in solidarity. And those stainless steel feathers do represent the strength and the resilience of the Choctaw. But if you look at it, if you look at this on YouTube or online, please do, because there is a fragility to these feathers that is remarkable. It is as if the wind could move them as you look at them. In 2017, the Choctaw came to Ireland, and both Irish and Choctaw joined in unison around that great circle in Bailick Park. And they brought their chants and they brought their drums. And Elder Gary Deerwhite said it was as if an arrow had cut through time. That we rekindle the link, he said, for we will never forget the connection. For the connection is what we are all about. When I think of these two noble peoples, I see great similarities. Yes, they have come through incredible oppression and come out as survivors. But also, there is a great similarity in their groundedness and their rootedness. These ancient peoples who value the interconnection of all life. The ancient peoples who celebrate the sacred arts of storytelling, of music and dance. These ancient peoples, both Choctaw and Irish, who honor family, who honor faith and the elements, and who honor the teachings of their elders. And I think the story could end just there. But there is a new development to the Choctaw and Indigenous people and the Irish. And that's this year, when we are all dealing with this extraordinary events of COVID-19. We each deal with this pandemic in our own way, and some of us and some communities have been affected more than others. And I think of the Navajo particularly, the Navajo of the Southwest. They are 300,000 in number. And they have been particularly hard hit, with great numbers of people dying of COVID. Now, why is this? Well, the reasons are outrageous. A third of the Navajo are in horrific conditions. They do not have clean running water, nor do they have electricity. They have no access to clean, good, nutritious food, nor do they have medical supplies or clinics available to them. And as is their wonderful custom to live closely knit with intergenerations, well, the spread of COVID became a fierce enemy. The Navajo were in great distress. Ethel Branch heard of this, and she said, "What are we to do? Our elders are dying, we have children that are sick." And she went to the youth of the Navajo, and they said, "Often we go to social media. Why not a GoFundMe page?" "Oh no," she said, "we could not." "Yes," they said, "we'll help you." And a GoFundMe page was set up for the Navajo community. This was just this past spring, 2020. And Ethel thought, well, perhaps a few $100. We'll give it a try. By June 2020, the Navajo Fund had reached $5 million. A third of that money, over a third, came from the Irish community. Oh, donations came from all over the world, but the Irish stepped forward, and they left notes on the FundMe page. We remember. I think Irish donor Tom Foley said it beautifully. He said, "Oh, we recall what you have done, and we support you in your time of need, as you very well supported us almost 2 centuries ago." And I think of this extraordinary peoples and their connection, their community, which continues to this day. And so I do want to travel to Bailick Park, right outside of Middleton in County Cork, and I see myself there at some point as I walk around this great monument, tribute to 2 noble peoples. And I will breathe in that compassion. And when no one's looking, I will take off my shoes and I will sit down in that great dish and I will breathe. And with that, I wish you all comfort and connection till we meet again.
These tellers, they always leave me teary-eyed. What do I say? Well, I guess on your behalf, I will thank Barbara and Cindy and Jennifer and Margaret for their stories. And on our behalf, we'd like to well, I can't thank me, can I? Oh, you guys, you're so suggestible. But on our behalf, we'd really like to thank Dr. Ted Cadillac, who is the magician with the technology, and Longevity John for taking a chance on us and giving this opportunity. And I hope we'll see you again, and I hope you really like the stories, because we don't have to convince the audience. We have to convince Longevity John, right?
Hey, I'm loving every bit of this. This is great. And we had a whole bunch of people watching, too. I think there was, like, at one time, 22, 23 from all over Canada watching. And that's not, that's just...
There was almost 40.
40, was there at one time?
Yeah.
See, it's really hard to tell because some people tune in for a part of it and then they take off, right? But the actual things, when you take a look tonight, I bet you we're up around 60, 80 people that who viewed this today or will by the end of midnight. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you very much, Lee, for being the host with the mostest. You got all the information out. I really enjoyed that. And we're coming back again in November and December. The December one's kind of neat because I wasn't aware of this, but storytelling and kind of ghostly style storytelling is done in that week after Christmas, before New Year's. It's a tradition. I didn't know this. See, all the things that you get to learn from storytellers. Eh? Thank you very much, all of you, for coming out tonight and engaging us with your words. Thank you very much. All did a very successful place. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ted Cadillac. And remember, you can donate. It's really simple. You just send it out through the PayPal, or you can send an e-transfer to longevityjohn@shaw.ca. Longevity John's, well, that's the nickname that my good friend Pat Temple gave you, right? You can call me Long for short, but you can't call me short for long. Speaking of stories. Anyway, we'll get going on this one. We'll see you at the end of November and then again in December. And I bet you we're going to continue this all the way through the new year. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in.
Slip by so fast upon the wind, and though you're in my dreams, well, I have been there times before. I hurt on the journey we don't know, rolling along the corridors, reflecting our lost souls. The valley looking down, past and future calling out, on this journey I have found new friends and loves that will remain on. Empty out my pockets, ripped our memories in the wind. I feel I'm going sideways, I feel I'm going too fast. All the sky could rain on me, and I'd still be in a daydream. I feel I'm going sideways. Well, I was singing rainbows until all the clouds slipped away. There was a time when blue skies were all that I could see, but blue skies are only daydreams, ones I can't afford to buy. And life is much too precious on to drift away. Feel I'm going sideways.